Welcome back to this faith group study in accordance with the Scriptures. As we noted last time, that phrase is found in the New Testament, in St. Paul's letters, and also in the Nicene Creed. And it proclaims that Jesus' life, death, and resurrection were all prophesied, signaled in the Old Testament. And that was a critically important insight for the early church. In fact, it was the only way to make sense out of Jesus dying a cursed death on the cross. There are many Old Testament texts, actually, that prepare the way for understanding what Jesus did. In this study, we're focusing on just 6 events or practices that help to point that out. And we began last time with God's demand to Abraham that he sacrifice Isaac. Today, we're going to look at one of the greatest works in all of literature, not just the Bible. The story of Joseph in Genesis 37 and 39 to 50 is a magnificent narrative. It's rooted in history, of course, but it is superbly told by an author. And quite apart from its historical and religious significance, it's just great writing. And so if you haven't read that whole account, or at least haven't read it recently, I really urge you to do so. The problem for this session, though, is that there is way too much material there to cover. So I'm going to hit some highlights that show the key dynamic for the theme of this session. But there's much more there to this amazing cycle of narratives. Well, Joseph's story starts in Genesis chapter 37, when he was 17 years old. Now, Joseph was the 11th of Jacob's 12 sons, and the first child of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. And that was the source of the family's scourge. And that was Jacob's rank favoritism. In verse 3 of Genesis 37, it says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other children." As a side note, Israel is now the new name that God gave to Jacob after he wrestled with the angel through the night. And yet Genesis continues to alternate between Jacob and Israel going forward. So, same guy. There's no difference between them. But Jacob not only favored Joseph, but he made no effort to disguise it. Continuing in Genesis 37:3, it says that he gave Joseph a special robe. Now, because of the King James Version of the Bible, that's widely called the robe of many colors, or in the musical, the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. But actually, a better translation is probably a robe with long or full sleeves. Now remember that Jacob and his sons were shepherds and cattlemen. So to be wearing a robe with long or full sleeves would have been an enormous hassle working with the animals. And because of that, then this coat that Jacob gave to Joseph indicates that Joseph been kicked up to middle management. He didn't have to do the hard work in the fields anymore. But as the 11th of 12 sons, he should have been one of the very last to be promoted. And the deadly result of all of this favoritism is named then in verse 4. Joseph's brothers hated him. Now it didn't help that Joseph appears to have been a spoiled brat. Back up in verse 2, it says that he was a tattletale who ran to daddy with bad reports of his brothers. But even worse, he proudly told 2 dreams that he had, in which first his brothers, then his brothers and parents bowed down to him. Now again, Joseph's low birth order made that scandalous and highly implausible. In fact, for his parents to bow down to him was offensive. And Jacob was ticked by it. Well, eventually things got so poisoned that his brothers decided to kill Joseph. Now, I think we've all gotten angry at parents or siblings, but can you imagine being so angry that you actually wanted to kill one of them? I mean, the depth of the dysfunction in this biblical family is really disturbing. Well, in the event, Reuben and Judah intervened and stopped the assassination plot. Instead, they put Joseph in a dry cistern instead. Still would have meant certain death, but just not outright murder. But kind of a distinction without a difference. But then, a group of slave traders came by. And so the brothers hauled Joseph out and sold him as a slave in Egypt. Now, it's very likely that the life expectancy of a slave in Egypt was really short. And so without doubt, Joseph's brothers believed they had seen the last of him. In fact, with a cruel kind of cynicism, they told Jacob that Joseph had no doubt been killed by a wild animal. And yet, in his intense grief over Joseph, Jacob became more obsessed with him than ever. And so if the brothers had hoped to cure Jacob of his favoritism, the plot failed miserably. While Joseph's life in Egypt was just a wild roller coaster ride, from heights to absolute depths. Now it's interesting, in this whole part of the story, God's name virtually never appears. And yet it's clear that he's directing the events from behind the scenes, particularly preserving Joseph and continuing to put him in places where he can thrive. Well, due to the lustful wife of his first master in Egypt, Joseph ended up in prison. But there he met two royal officials from Pharaoh's court who had each had a strange dream. Now, Joseph denied any ability to interpret those dreams himself, but he did claim that God could give the interpretation. And the interpretations Joseph gave turned out to be exactly right. In 3 days, Pharaoh's cupbearer was restored to his office, and in 3 days, Pharaoh's baker was hanged to death. Well, as the cupbearer headed out of prison, Joseph asked him to remember him before Pharaoh, because he was in prison unjustly. But the cupbearer forgot. He was too excited about his own restoration. But then Pharaoh had two troubling dreams, and that jogged the cupbearer's memory. And so Joseph was hauled out of prison, cleaned up, brought to Pharaoh, and again gave all the credit to God, but interpreted the dreams correctly. And Pharaoh was so impressed that he made Joseph prime minister of Egypt on the spot. And talk about whiplash for Joseph. I mean, from the outhouse to the penthouse in one afternoon. Well, as you likely remember, Pharaoh's dreams concerned a coming famine. But that famine wasn't only in Egypt, it also reached Canaan, where Jacob and Joseph's brothers still lived. And if you look at Genesis 42, the first verse is almost kind of funny. Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you keep looking at one another? I've heard there is grain in Egypt." Gives a picture as if his brothers were nervously giving each other the side eye, as if they wanted to avoid going to Egypt. But if so, it was only because the thought of Egypt stirred up their guilt of what they had done to Joseph. There is zero chance that they expected to run into Joseph there. Again, they probably assumed by now he was dead. But of course, it's exactly what happened. They went to buy grain, and unbeknownst to them, came into Joseph's presence, who's running the whole show. So, of course, they didn't recognize him, but Joseph instantly recognized them. I mean, he would have looked dramatically different as an Egyptian official, but more so, they didn't expect him to be alive, much less the number 2 man in Egypt. And so as his brothers came in and bowed down before him, fulfilling the dream, Joseph instantly hatched an ingenious plot to test them. First, he treated them in a wildly inconsistent way, unnerving them by his manner. First, he was very harsh to them for no good reason, then over the top kind and blessing them, and then he worked tricks behind their backs. It's kind of an early case of psychological warfare that just kept them on their heels, kept them off balance. And intriguingly, as they're being treated this way, it instantly stirred up guilt in the brothers over how they had treated Joseph. I mean, they still didn't know that's who they were dealing with. But guilt is the gift that keeps on giving. And this had never been resolved in them. But second, Joseph then elicited from his brothers the fact that there was one last brother, Benjamin, still back at home. And it was crucial for Joseph to avoid giving the slightest hint that he already knew that. But it was also essential that the brothers would volunteer that information. Now, Benjamin was Joseph's only full brother, the other son of Rachel. And even though he hadn't been home in years, it wasn't a stretch to imagine that Jacob favored Benjamin too. And in fact, Jacob had utterly refused to let Benjamin go to Egypt. He would not take the risk of losing him too. But as Joseph worked his plot, he cornered the brothers and Jacob into allowing Benjamin, forcing Benjamin, to come down to Egypt. And when Joseph first set sights on his full brother, it's really a deeply poignant scene. Genesis 43:29 says, "Then Joseph saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, 'Is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? God be gracious to you, my son.' And with that, Joseph hurried out because he was overcome with affection for his brother and was about to weep. So he went into a private room and wept there." But Joseph had to compose himself quickly in order to complete his plot. And so before the brothers headed back home, Joseph had his silver cup placed in Benjamin's grain sack. And as soon as the brothers were on their way, Joseph sent his officers chasing after them and stopped them, accused them of stealing the silver cup. The brothers, of course, knew they were innocent. And so they protested by making a rash vow. Genesis 44:9. They said, "Should the cup be found with any one of us, let him die. Moreover, the rest of us will become Joseph's slaves." Of course, they never dreamt that Benjamin actually had the silver cup. And as you read the text, and Joseph's officials are opening one grain sack after another, from the oldest brother to the youngest, the tension is just unbearable, until suddenly there's the cup in Benjamin's sack. Of course, the brothers are completely unnerved by this. They go flying back and come into Joseph's presence, bow down before him. This is now the second time they fulfilled his childhood dream. But they still don't know that. They only know that they are in a heap of trouble. Now here we need to go back and recall the beginning of the whole story. Remember, Joseph had been blatantly favored by Jacob. And as a result, his brothers envied Joseph. They hated him. They planned to kill him. and ended up selling him as a slave. Well, Joseph realized that Benjamin was likely just as favored by Jacob as he had been. And so the question in his heart and mind was whether the brothers hated Benjamin just as much as they had hated him. Were they still resentful and envious of Jacob's favoritism toward Benjamin? And Joseph's whole plot was a powerful, anonymous test to see if they had changed in any way. And in Genesis 44, Judah, acting as spokesman for the brothers, stepped up and passed the test with flying colors. First of all, he rehearsed the whole dilemma, how all this had happened, emphasizing that Joseph had really caused all the trouble. And then Judah revealed a deep compassion, both for Jacob, his father, and Benjamin, his brother. Read along at Genesis 44, verse 27, and note this is Judah speaking. Also, that he repeatedly uses this humble term, your servant. He really means I or me, but rather than using the first person, he refers to himself and to Jacob too as your humble servant. Genesis 44:27. Then your servant my father said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One left me, and I said, surely he has been torn to pieces, and I have never seen him since. If you take this one, Benjamin, from me as well, and harm comes to him, you will bring down my gray hairs in sorrow to Sheol, the place of the dead. Now, therefore, Judah says, when I come to your servant my father, and the boy is not with us, then as his life is bound up in the boy's life. When he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die, and your servants will bring down the gray hairs of your servant our father with sorrow to Sheol. For your servant, Judah, became surety for the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I will bear the blame in the sight of my father all my life. Now, therefore, please let your servant remain as a slave to my Lord in place of the boy, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the suffering that would come upon my father. Well, far from resenting Jacob or hating Benjamin, Judah freely offered to take Benjamin's place, to bear his punishment, for both Jacob and Benjamin's sakes. That was what Joseph needed to know, that their hearts had changed, that they weren't filled with all this resentment and hatred, but actually loved one another. And so finally Joseph was able to reveal himself to his brothers, and the text is striking. If you look at Genesis 45, verse 1, then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, send everyone away from me. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Can you feel the years of heartache and loneliness just pouring out of Joseph? And of course, the brothers' dismay is due both to shock and fear. I mean, imagine trying to wrap your head around the fact that this high Egyptian official is actually the brother you sold into slavery all those years ago. But that revelation meant that the brothers had some serious splaining to do. And Joseph was in a position of power to wreak revenge on them. In fact, sadly, the brothers' dismay and distrust of Joseph runs right to the very end of the account. Their guilt ran so deep that they couldn't shake their fear of Joseph's revenge. Well, it's in Judah's speech that we get a clear foreshadowing of the gospel. For we stand accused, like them, except, of course, we're actually guilty of our sin. The wages of sin is death, but we have no means to escape that sentence. But Christ, our heavenly brother, freely offered himself in our place. His crucifixion was driven by love far greater even than Judah's for Jacob and Benjamin. But Judah's concern for Jacob and Benjamin mirrors, foreshadows, gives a marvelous hint of Christ's far greater compassion for sinners. And so Judah's noble act in offering to take Benjamin's place for his sake and Jacob's sake helps to explain what it means that Jesus became sin, died in our stead, in order to put sin to death and save us from condemnation. And it powerfully illustrates how Jesus' death was in accordance with the Scriptures. We'll now have some great discussion in your groups, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.